This edition of the Lloyd's List podcast is brought to you by Vesson. There is a very detailed and, frankly, really bloody complicated series of policy discussions happening right now inside the walls of the International Maritime Organization. And that's not what we're going to be talking about this week. Well, not entirely. The question of whether the IMO can stick to its timetable and agree the basic architecture of shipping's energy transition via a fuel standard and some kind of levy is, of course, important. It's important in terms of demand signals to fuel producers, regulatory certainty for an industry that is in limbo, but it's also going to determine whether we continue to have a global regulation for shipping or not. If what the IMO agrees, and I think we're now working on the assumption that they will agree something, but if what they agree is not ambitious enough, we still face the likely proliferation of national and regional bloc legislations to come. There is still a scenario where this all collapses around us. But we're not talking about that, not yet at least. What we're talking about is what happens beyond the IMO, because what gets agreed inside the MEPC, the Marine Environment Protection Committee, and what flavour of levy they choose to scoop into the international framework is not the final course, is not even the starter. This is an amuse-bouche to whet your appetite for the gut-busting 20-course tasting menu ahead of us. All of which is to say there is a long list of practical and political factors for shipping to consider beyond an IMO discussion. And the industry really needs to be preparing itself for a grueling series of changes to come over the next few years.
My colleagues are always smiling at me because I always say that decarbonizing shipping is an ultra-marathon and not a sprint, right? We cannot expect to achieve it tomorrow.
That's Andrea Olivi, the head of wet freight at trading giant Trafigura. And I'm starting this week with him because I want to inject a note of reality and pragmatism back into this conversation. There is a lot to do, and as discussed in previous editions of this podcast, this is not about picking a fuel and waiting for the regulation to close the price gap and make it viable.
Much like with every complex problems, we need to break it into smaller tasks. And we have some tasks that are useful in the short term, others in the medium term, and then long term, right? And with long term, I really mean a 2050 horizon. And frankly speaking, I don't know about you, but I plan to be around in 2050, so I'm quite interested in seeing how this develops, right? So the last 12 months have been complicated. On one hand, we have seen disruption in Panama Canal, and in the Red Sea, right? And all of this has caused major shipping segments to take longer routes, and therefore we have increased the amount of emissions that all major shipping segments produce, right? So because of that, we already have to do more than what we thought we had to do. Today, we are emitting more than what we thought we were emitting because of the rerouting. Now, the silver lining here is that as a result of these disruptions, the shipping industry is enjoying a period of, let's face it, extraordinary profits. And many companies have been able to use these profits to slash debt and reinvest in CapEx. Now, the majority of this CapEx investment has been redirected towards retrofitting energy-saving devices and towards ordering new buildings with dual-fuel alternative propulsion systems, right? So this is already a positive. This is one positive, I would say. So there is some extra capex which is going towards dual-fuel technology. Now, one of the things that I absolutely love about my job today is that by talking to shipyards, by talking to ship owners, by talking to traders and fuel producers, it's really possible to take a helicopter view on the decarbonization problem, right? From hearing all the actors in the industry. When you speak to the yards, they are ready to build dual fuel vessels. They are ready. They may not love it because they like standardization, but the technology is there and they can do it. When you speak to engine makers, they're also ready. They can produce the engines. You speak to the majority of the owners, And they are a bit reluctant to make an extra CapEx investment unless they have long-term backing by charters. The charters, they don't want to pay a premium to conventional vessels unless they are absolutely sure that they can somehow gain an advantage through it, right? We're then left with fuel producers. And this is really the interesting bunch, I think, because they are the ones that need to create the green molecules. And producing green molecules takes time and takes money. And you're not going to embark in such a project unless you have what I think is the two most important words right now for the industry and for decarbonization: demand signals. Demand signals are vital to give confidence to fuel producers, and this is why it's so important that present and future regulations focus on this. If you focus on developing the right demand signals, supply will come. It may take 2, it may take 3 years, but the supply will come because the fuel producers will have the confidence to make the necessary investments. Now, you were mentioning regulations, right? So let's talk about regulations and what they can do to promote demand signals. We have discussed this before, I believe, and you know that I'm quite a big supporter of what the EU has done for shipping decarbonizations recently. First with the EU ETS and now with the FuelEU Maritime. They both put a price on emissions, which is ultimately what we need in order to decarbonize. But over the last 12 months, I learned something very interesting. And I've learned that FuelEU Maritime is a far better regulation than EU ETS when it comes to the ability to instigate the right demand signals. And this is because through the fee-based system and the pooling system, it encourages investment in greener fuels, much more than EU ETS. And this is because through the pooling system, the owners can reallocate some of their compliance spending to e-fuel purchase. And this is very powerful because then it allows to generate demand for offtake agreement, which is exactly the kind of demand signals which fuel producers need to build green fuel facilities. So for me, and I've really seen it firsthand, let's say, that this can work. You may ask, please provide me with give me an example, and I can tell you, FuelEU Maritime was a big driver behind two of Trafigura's most recent investments in decarbonization. One is our long-term biofuel offtake agreement with TFG, and the second one is our new building MGC dual-fuel ammonia order. Both investments will help to reduce our shipping emissions, but we'll do it in very different ways.
Now, the fuel investment point that Andrea raises there is obviously a key tipping point we need to be keeping an eye on. Climate-friendly hydrogen was one of the most hyped sectors in green energy. Now the reality of its high cost is taking its toll. In recent months, some of the biggest would-be developers of the fuel have cancelled projects and axed orders and scaled back investment plans. The low-carbon fuel is simply too expensive to stimulate demand in many sectors of the economy. Those demand signals are important, and they're important for shipping, but it also highlights the fact that we're not yet at the point the industry can reliably talk about supply. There is still a lot of dots to be joined between government, ports, fuel suppliers, and shipping as one of the main industries in a long queue for this molecule. And that's why the political discussions outside the IMO are equally significant right now, and why Ihila Karen, LR's Maritime Decarbonisation Hub's senior lead on green initiatives, was out in Namibia recently trying to raise the profile of shipping in the nascent but pivotal African hydrogen projects.
The reason why we're looking at hydrogen-based fuels is to remove us from that conversation about which fuels, and it's very easy to go down that road of kind of warring over different positions, whereas actually if we're looking at the core molecule that feeds into those products, we sort of remove slightly more of that political discussion around what fuels it is. Obviously, there's a biofuel and e-fuels discussion as well, but where we're sort of coming at it from is really about how we develop that even to have a narrative about e-fuels, we need to ensure that the hydrogen pipeline is in place to service that future discussion about what future fuels there are. So yes, I agree, this is an ultra marathon, and like it was interesting being in Namibia, because a big part of why we were there was we feel like there still needs to be a lot more work done to bring together both the energy and the maritime sectors closer together. But it was also for us to get a feel of kind of where maritime is on, the hydrogen industry's radar as well. So a big push from our side as part of the Maritime Fuel Supply Dialogues is how do we bring those two communities closer together? How do we ensure that both from a bottom-up approach, because we're seeing lots of green corridors and all this lovely stuff, we're also included in that, but, that's happening, but how to actually operationalize a lot of that, we probably need more of a top-down steer. So literal energy ministers and transport ministers talking to each other about what that maritime strategy looks like. And there are lots of these like wonderful hydrogen strategies that are developed, but when you look at them, international shipping isn't really even part of that narrative and that story. So it's really about putting ourselves on that agenda and being part of that, rather than sort of being left out of these conversations, especially at the start of the hydrogen kind of economy discussion.
The point that I'm trying to highlight here is that while we are necessarily getting lost in the weeds of the MEPC discussions right now, the bigger picture is that shipping is still not yet fully on the radar of the wider energy transition discussions like the ones in Namibia. The maritime hubs are a great development, but they are not yet front and centre in energy ministerial agendas. Power generation, fertilisers, many other markets, they are there. We are not. Yet. And so we're back to the question of what is a sufficiently influential demand signal.
Actually, the absolute worst and what we want to avoid is exactly what happened, unfortunately, a few weeks ago, when a prominent methanol producer scrapped plans to build a large methanol facility in Sweden, right? But then you hear wider scrapping and guess what? They say lack of demand signals. So it's about demand signals, and it's about the regulations that can help that. And Fuel EU Maritime will help. Now, Fuel EU Maritime has not kicked in yet, so we haven't quite seen it, but it will come. Now, what is the problem? It's the same old problem that me and you have discussed many times. It's a regional measure, so we need it applied at a global scale. But it's interesting to hear that a measure similar to Fuel EU Maritime, or a measure that uses, let's say, the same concept, fee-based concept and pooling concept, is being considered at an IMO level. And I can tell you, I think that that could really help to generate, let's say, the right demand signals, which the industry really needs.
From multi-jurisdictional regulations to geopolitics and decarbonisation, the maritime ecosystem is more complex than ever. This is creating unprecedented levels of risk exposure. With trusted maritime data and built-for-purpose workflows from Vesson Nautical, you can confidently make decisions to better manage risk and maximise profit. For over 20 years, Vesson has been co-innovating with the world's largest buyers and sellers of bulk freight. Join our client community and find your decision advantage. Learn more at vesson.com.
I am aware that I'm in danger of sounding like a broken record here. It can feel like these conversations go round and round in circles. But that's why I want to bring in here Lara Nakushbandi. She's the CEO of ET Fuels, an e-methanol developer. But I should point out that she's not coming at this as a tree hugger, but from a deep background in finance. And her point is that if this is an ultramarathon, then we need to be training for it. The industry is entering a phase that requires a different approach to its understanding of fuel supply and procurement and the coming regulation. This isn't about passively waiting for these demand signals to magically appear.
I would say a couple of things. I would say, we can sort of sit here in tenterhooks pretending to be so unclear as to where the regulation is going to pan out, right? The regulation is only going one way. So I think to some extent, we already kind of know where the end state is. I think when I think about this whole, it's a marathon, not a sprint. I have a slightly different take on it, right? And if I consider, what can shipping companies do, or what should they be doing amidst all of this uncertainty, right? most of them are looking at this and saying, it is a marathon. The impact really only hits me in 2030. And it would be better for me to sit here and wait and see how everything pans out than to act today. And we did that with IMO 2020, and we got ourselves together last minute. It was all fine, right? So my view on this, though, is that what we are seeing now is actually very different. And it's different for two reasons. The first reason it's different is that, at least if you look at Fuel EU, that is not a one-size-fits-all tax, right? That is not just something the industry can pass on to the end customer. There are incentives in there to reward first movers and to penalise the late guys. And so if you sit back and wait and see, and your competitors are moving forward and preparing, you're going to see huge industry disruption. And these are material impacts to your financials, right? So, and then you just wake up in 2030, on your marathon, and maybe you don't actually get to sprint because you're done, right? So that's one thing that I think is different. The second thing that I think is different, and I very much agree it's a marathon, is where we are going today, you don't have the same fuel dynamics as you do at present. So what I mean by that, IMO 2020, you could kind of get your act together relatively last minute because the fuel was available, right? Low sulfur fuel was available. You didn't have to prepare for that. If I think about the kinds of green fuels we need today, whether it's biofuels, right, and the incredibly short supply of biofuels, or whether it's e-fuels, which are a genuine marathon, 6 years for an e-fuels project to be developed minimum, you actually need to start planning way, way earlier. And so the real marathon has to start now. You can't start your marathon in 2030. And so I think there's a fundamental difference that most people in the industry are just not acknowledging.
And so we're back to this point that the industry's preparedness is not just about having the right ships for the right fuels and the right supplies. We're talking about having the sophistication to deal with the regulatory environment that is going to include emissions trading and much more complicated procurement processes. Things are going to get much more complicated for shipping generally over the next few years, and it's not just a question of waiting for some fuel to be available.
I mean, how do you manage that, right? You don't stick your head in the sand and just hope it goes away. I think, the number one rule in portfolio management is diversification, right? A diversified portfolio will win every day of the week. Obviously, I'm a big fan of e-methanol, right? That's the part that I think is a robust one. But I mean, no one should sit here and say it is e-methanol, it is LNG, it is e-ammonia. And as you pointed out, there'll be different horses for different courses. What everyone should be doing, though, is thinking about what is the optionality that I can create in my portfolio so that whatever happens, and particularly if you were a big company, now I get it, small companies, you don't really have the ability to kind of, create a whole bunch of options. That's costly if you've got a small fleet. But any big company that is saying it is this or it is that, I don't get it. I think there should be a whole bunch of options created if you have the ability to spread that across a big fleet. So that's one. And I think there's a question about what does that look like in practice, right? So obviously you need to resource and have the capabilities to better manage all of these new risk exposures, right? And we see that across industries, right? Everybody's compliance teams are growing. So that's just a given. But I think beyond that, and this is a bit cliched, but really thinking about partnerships and going upstream. So, whether that's, all of the initiatives around port infrastructure and corridors, that's great. But fundamentally, the big bottleneck in all of this, in the end-to-end value chain, it's not the infrastructure, it's not the customer, it is the supply of the fuel. Biofuels, I mean, which people talk about using used cooking oil. If you took every single McDonald's in the UK and used their cooking oil, you'd produce 5,000 tonnes per annum of green fuel. It's tiny. And then on the e-fuel side, the challenge we have, which is obviously an opportunity for companies like ourselves, the challenge we have is the big guys just aren't playing there today. And so you have all these independent developers like ourselves who are bringing these fuels to market, and that's fine. We've seen other industries develop, renewables, ethanol, all small independent developers. But we need partnerships, we need third-party financing, and so we need customer demand. And so if I think about what does it mean to create that optionality, of course, get your resource in place, get your capabilities in place, but think about going upstream and figuring out where you're going to get your fuel from and building those partnerships now, because these projects take time.
Indeed, it takes time. And money, of course. And yes, it has become clear that the hydrogen market is developing more slowly than anticipated, and there remains risk and both input cost and technology advancements to overcome. But Lara is an interesting voice here because she is very much of the opinion that actually the maths do add up.
Obviously, it comes down to your assumptions, right? So, and fundamentally, if I really sort of break it down, where I think people are getting their assumptions wrong, right? We can all see the penalties in Fuel EU, and I'll talk about Fuel EU, and even, whatever comes with the IMO. The issue is that people think they can get there with existing fuels. I definitely believe it'll be a multi-fuel environment as much as I'm doing e-methanol. And so this is not to bash the other fuels, but they have their constraints. So I'll give you like the zingers that I hear people sort of pass from one person to another, which is just not true. So LNG is an example, 15% decarbonisation, 20%, whatever you want your number to be, right? That is a respectable decarbonisation number. The issue, though, is that is just one ship. And so just simple maths, right? If in 2030, you have to reduce your emission intensity by 6% across your entire fleet. If you've got 100 ships and you replace some of them with LNG, you've basically, to get to that number, I mean, I've had some maths bod run, it's not particularly hard math, but just to get your head around it, you would have to replace 40 ships at a 15% reduction to get 6% across your entire fleet. That is a massive asset replacement cycle, right? And then you've got to do it again in 2035, but with all your ships. And then just when you've replaced them, you've got to replace them again with green fuels. So it's just, energy just doesn't get you far enough, right? And then people talk about bio-LNG, biofuels. And, we talk to customers and say, I can go out and get biofuels tomorrow if I want, right? But when you actually do the maths, right, if we were to be in a world where the shipping industry was to meet its, let's say IMO 20% reduction by 2030, you would basically see shipping need to go from using 0.2% of the world's global biofuels today to around 60% of them by 2030. It's just not going to happen, right? And so people sit there, and we have these conversations all the time, how are you going to meet your 2030 targets? Well, I'm doing LNG, or I'll do biofuels. There's just a disconnect in people's spreadsheets between reality and what is actually possible in real life. So that's one. And I think the second is, as I said, the calculations are only really being done on how these regulations are going to drive behaviour. And I've had conversations, people have said things to me like, I've just, some of the more sophisticated operators said to me, we've just run the maths and we're surprised at just how much we can pay for e-methanol for this to make sense. And just to give you some numbers, right? We've been through the spreadsheets with all the major think tanks, consultants. It's all the same set of assumptions. Willingness to pay for e-methanol, you can get to about $2,000 per ton, which is about 6 times what grey methanol trades at today, right? Honestly, that is not a difficult levelized cost of methanol to hit for anybody. I mean, we can produce significantly cheaper, but that kind of a level incentivizes all kinds of projects. And so I think people just need to start doing the maths and being realistic about what their alternatives are, and then they will get to the same place.
In some respects, this is more of the same. All of this leaves shipping executives walking a tightrope. On the one hand, they need the foresight to plan for the long term, the big ultramarathon, navigating the next 5 to 10, even 15 years of trade dynamics. On the other hand, they need the flexibility to shift course almost overnight, adapting to the latest global tremor. But I think it's important to call out some of the nuances in all this and temper expectations that the MEPC is somehow going to wave a magic wand, because it really isn't. So good luck with your training for the ultramarathon. At least you have a regular podcast to keep you company on the long training sessions ahead. My thanks to Andrea, Ahila and Lara for taking the time to talk to me for this one. Thanks also to Vesson for sponsoring this edition. And thank you for listening. Have a good week, everyone. We'll be back next week with more of the stories shaping shipping. Bye.